Hello, and welcome back to Lauren's Legends. Have you ever bought a house and wondered about its history, only to find out that terrible things had happened in it? What would you do? Immediately pack up and leave? Try to tough it out? Make friends with the spirits that may still be there? Today, we are going to be diving into a house where people met their ends by dark circumstances, and we'll be covering the mysterious happenings after new people moved into it. So sit back, relax, and enjoy, and you might want to turn a light on for this one. The house we are covering is the house named the House of Death in New York City's Greenwich Village. If you know anything about New York City, then you know that real estate is hard to come by, and the street this house is on is prime real estate. But there just so happens to be one house on West 10th Street that no one wants to own. This beautiful brick home was built back in 1856 and has been said to have an evil presence about it since the day it was completed, and that it has a way of taking over anyone that dares to live in it. The history of this house goes so far back, and it does not seem to start becoming sinister until after the first owners moved out. These owners were the Borman family. They were a very prominent family and the founders of the Underground Railroad and the Broadway Underground Railroad. After James Borman Johnson passed away in the home, his widow moved her and her daughters out of the home. Some believe that this somehow upset the spirit of the home and it would become a curse to whomever else moved in. The second owner moved in 1897. His name was Fred H. Andrew. He was a well-known cycling celebrity. After only being there for a few months, it is reported that he had begun to become very depressed, and there seemed to be no reason for it. He was still very successful, his love life was great, but there was just something that was really, really deeply bothering him. On August 9th, 1897, Fred was out riding his bike like he always did, and he accidentally hit an 8-year-old boy. He broke the boy's leg, and it caused Fred to be arrested for reckless bicycle riding. I have never heard of that before. After this, the house passed hands several times for 3 years, only to then be rented out by its most famous tenant, the one and only Mark Twain. The author moved in the year of 1900 at the height of his fame, but towards the end of his writing career, and he only stayed in the home for just over a year. During this time, he began battling bankruptcy and was fighting a dark depression. He began pushing out his writings as fast as he could for any bit of money he could get, and those works actually became some of his most well-known stories. The interesting thing about his stay there, though, is that even though he was a paranormal skeptic, he had his own experience that he was never able to fully rationalize and tried to just blame it on rats. The story goes that one night while he was working, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye and looked over to see a piece of wood moving and floating in the air. He actually grabbed his pistol and shot at it. Suddenly, the wood dropped to the ground, and he even saw specks of blood, but he never did see the rat scurry away. After Mark Twain moved out, the house passed through many hands for 37 years. In 1937, the house had been converted into a building made up of 10 separate condos. Interestingly, Mark Twain did not pass away in this house, but his presence was one of the most common that people began reporting once the 10 condos had begun being rented out. And people do believe that construction can stir things up in the house. And people began seeing Mark Twain. It is said that he could constantly be seen going up and down the stairs, and the stairs are constantly referred to being the most haunted portion of the whole house. Not only had people begun hearing marching noises coming from vacant parts of the building, and the theory was that it was Mark Twain pacing back and forth, stressed with writer's block. After the renovations, one of the new tenants that moved in was a young mother. Her and her daughter said that they ran in to Mark Twain sitting at the window seat. His apparition stood up and came at them quickly. He said, "I has a problem and I gotta settle." And then he disappeared. We will never know what his issue was, but many believe it is strange that his spirit seems to be stuck in this building, even though he passed away in Connecticut. And he passed away under very weird circumstances. But it's almost like he can't leave this place for eternity. The next notable resident is that of Bryant Bartell. She moved in 1957 with her daughter. They took the apartment on the very top floor. Now, Jan was somewhat different than the past tenants. She was a famous actress and writer, and she was also a self-proclaimed psychic. She would later talk about her first time in the house. She did not get a bad feeling, but once the lease was signed and she had moved in with her daughter, it was as if all of the spirits had come out of hiding. Jan reported that it was immediately as if a monstrous moving shadow would haunt her and follow her around the house. When she began feeling these things, she started working on a manuscript unlike anything she had ever written before. One of the passages say that she had seen a ghostly figure of a man standing in the hall. Bravely, she reached out and tried to touch whatever she was seeing. She felt something, but nothing like she had ever felt before. She described it as such, a substance without substance, chilly, damp as marsh mist or a cloud of ether. I could feel my fingers freeze at the tips, but they were numb, and yet they tingled. In the split second between contact and recoil, the scent came, fragile and sweet, unbearably cloyingly sweet. Jan and her daughter experienced many other oddities too. Food that she had not purchased would appear on her table, and when she would go to inspect it, she would see that the food was already rotting and there would be flies around it. Once you get insects from food that's rotten that you didn't buy, vacate the premises, okay? Other things that would happen is she started noticing that her small dogs would become very aggressive towards anyone and would constantly be barking and growling at the wall and in the corners, cowering at all times of the day and night. Desperate and needing help that was further than her own experience, she reached out to a paranormal expert to help her find out what she was dealing with. She needed to try to understand this and if it was directed at her and if her and her daughter were in danger. When the investigator entered the home, he immediately got sick and struggled to continue to the corridor towards the stairs. He proclaimed that the building was a house of death and that there were at least 22 angry spirits trapped there. He did name Mark Twain as one. Another was an angry woman in a white dress and a young girl that kept following them around and tugging on his clothes. Last but not least, he also saw an angry gray cat hissing at her apartment door. After about 30 minutes in the building, the investigator told Jan that he was overwhelmed and still felt sick and that he needed to leave. He also warned her that she should do the same as soon as she could afford to. Jan went back up to her apartment, and when she opened her door, her small dog began barking and biting close to her ankles. She now knew that it was because an angry cat was hissing from the other side. Desperate and trying to come to terms with living in a possessed house, she did the only thing she could think of to do in that moment and picked up her manuscript and began recounting everything that she had been living through. The title then came to her, Spindrift, Spray from a Psychic Sea, as she was writing more strange noises that she could never place began, almost as if the house was angry that she was trying to reveal its secrets. Then, in Jan's own words, Like a game of the Indians, deaths began to occur in the house. The first one was her own pup, Penelope, that had been living in her own terror. She unexpectedly and without reason was found passed away in the morning, laying beside the door. Then, within 24 hours of finding Penelope, she found out about the death of one of her fellow tenants, and then several more deaths came from people in the apartments all around her. Some were heart attacks, some had ended themselves, and one was murder. 9 deaths happened within days of the paranormal investigator coming in, and she couldn't help but think that some of this had been her fault. She quickly packed everything she could and left, even leaving some of her furniture. Jan would finish her manuscript only a few weeks later, and then days after, she herself passed away in very strange circumstances. Some say that she was murdered, and others believe that she ended herself because of the voices and the curse calling her back to the house. Regardless of whichever one it is, it's still undetermined to this day. Her book was released and you can still buy it today, but be careful. You never know. Some say they feel a calling to go to that building through the pages, pulling them in. I wish that I could say that after those 9 deaths that happened so quickly together that the house had gotten its fill, but no, the story is not over and it only gets darker. A terrible tragedy happened at the House of Death on November 2nd, 1987. What I'm about to tell you has a plot worthy of a horror film. Early in the AM, around 6:40, 911 got a call from a distressed mother named Hedda Nussbaum. She was screaming that her 8-year-old daughter named Lisa wasn't breathing. The 911 operator tried to calm the mother down and talk her through CPR while the ambulance was racing over to the scene. When the paramedics did arrive, they were absolutely not prepared for the grisly scene that they were walking into. Little Lisa was lying naked in the middle of the kitchen floor and she was unresponsive. Her little brother Mitchell was screaming and tied to a playpen soaked in his own waste. Hedda herself had several broken bones and bruises all over her. The authorities found all kinds of illicit substances littered throughout the apartment and $25,000 in cash. Unfortunately, little Lisa passed away on the way to the hospital. The doctors were able to determine that she had passed from repeated blunt force trauma to her head. After investigating the situation, Lisa's father, Joe Steinberg, who was a lawyer and had never been in trouble before, began experiencing extreme depression after they had moved into the house and went quickly down a dark road of substances. The night that everything happened, Joel went on a binge, planning to end himself, but instead he attacked Hedda and Lisa. He was originally charged with first-degree murder, but in court he didn't hold anything back. He stated that it was the house and that there was an evil in it that began controlling him, getting darker and darker. With his testimony and other witnesses in the building, the jury actually believed it, and he was only charged with manslaughter in the 2nd degree. He was actually released in 2004 and has lived peacefully ever after, never getting into trouble again. The years continue to go by, and people continue to move in and out, and people continue to pass away, always seeming to feed the house the energy that it is always searching for. But the neighbors say sometimes when there are not many tenants there and it is a transition period, the apartments next door see their own lights begin to flicker, and they also see ghostly figures, almost as if it's trying to break through those 4 walls that hold the terror inside. What do you think about this building? Do you believe that everything is completely exaggerated? Do you think it's just a coincidence that so many deaths have occurred there and that it is so old it would just be a normal thing that happens? Or do you think there could be truth in the name the house has been given, and sitting on a beautiful historic street in New York City, there really is a house of death? Please let me know what you think about this one in the comment section down below. Please do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I am going to do my best to try to sleep tonight. Have a great one, and I will see you next time.